guys, I'm Richard Holdner and welcome to the channel. Let's talk about dual plane intake manifolds. I'm talking about the factory cast iron dual planes. You know, the ones we always throw away and replace with a cool aftermarket aluminum intake manifold. But how well do those cast iron dual planes really work? More importantly, how well does a dual plane intake manifold compare to a long runner EFI? Can a dual plane actually make more low speed torque? This video is all about dual plane intake performance. First, we're going to compare some factory cast iron dual plane intake manifolds to their aluminum aftermarket counterparts. How well does the factory stuff compare to the aftermarket stuff? Then we're going to compare a dual plane intake manifold, carbureted, versus a long runner factory EFI intake, also known for low speed torque production. The question is, can the dual plane carbureted intake manifold compete with a long runner EFI intake manifold? Which one makes more torque? Our first intake comparison shows that not all dual plane intake manifolds are obviously designed the same. They're designed with different things in mind, and this is especially the case when we compare factory dual plane intake manifolds compared to aftermarket dual planes like we did on this 460 Ford. So our test motor was a 460 from the Junkyard. It was actually a 1968 version, so the high compression 460 version. It had stock heads. We ran it with a stock cast iron 4-barrel intake manifold. It had the stock cam and stock rockers. Basically, it was just pulled out of the wrecking yard. As it turned out, this thing it was already rebuilt once in its life. Not surprising given the fact that it's a 1968 460. It was already bored 60 over, but everything else was stock on it. It was just a rebuild, and they put it back together. So we ran it first with, this thing was equipped with 2-inch long tube headers and extensions, but no mufflers. It had the mechanical 460 water pump on it. And we had we just adjusted the distributor basically to optimize the power output. We ran a 750 Holley carburetor on this with the Percy's adjusted jet. So basically it just allowed us to adjust the jetting externally by turning it. So it was really nice for, and quick and easy way to adjust the air-fuel ratio on this thing. So we ran it first with the stock cast iron 4-barrel intake manifold run on the 460. And this thing produced a whopping 349 horsepower, which actually is not too bad. And this thing also produced a peak of 492 foot-pounds of torque with the stock exhaust, or the stock intake manifold. So after that, we replaced that with an aluminum WEIAND dual plane intake manifold. And here's what happened when we ran the WEIAND intake manifold. You can see the WEIAND intake manifold did indeed improve power. I mean, it made peak power was up to 363 horsepower. So better than the factory intake manifold out on the top. But what you want to look at is look what happened down low. For peak torque, the WEIAND produced 478 foot-pounds. It was down in terms of peak torque, but also it was down from about 3,500 RPM down low. We loaded this thing at 2,500 RPM because we knew this thing wasn't going to be making like lots of high RPM power, especially with the stock camshaft. We only ran this thing to 5,500. But down at 2,500, you see a big change in torque. In fact, here at 2,600, we're looking at 452 foot-pounds for the WEIAND intake manifold to 487 foot-pounds for the stock intake manifold. And just goes to show you they're both dual plane design, but the factory was much more interested in torque production down low where most big blocks are going to be running, even though this 460 would have been in like a full-size car. Lots of low-speed power, so if you're wanting something that's really going to like spin the tires, the factory 4-barrel intake manifold actually works pretty well. Let's get to our next test. Our next comparison was run on a small block Chevy, and it is the factory cast iron Q-jet intake manifold versus a WEIAND 8004 Q-jet manifold. We ran both of them obviously with the same quadrajet, and this small block was a basically bone stock one. It had forged pistons in it and forged rods because we were going to be eventually taking this thing as far as it would go in terms of all kinds of different power outputs. We're eventually going to put airflow research heads on it and a big hydraulic roller cam and a single plane, a big carburetor, and all kinds of stuff. But I went through step by step documenting what each one of these did. So it was originally equipped with the forged short block, but a set of 882 heads just bone stock ones, 1 5/8 headers, and then the factory cast iron Q-jet intake manifold, common on a lot of small blocks. And then obviously we optimized the timing and the jetting and the quadrajet. And the quadrajet was supplied by the guys at Sean Murphy, who do a good job. We also ran this, and I'm going to show you, we ran this thing with a 2-barrel, a 2G, 2-barrel version of the quadrajet and intake manifold, but run with the 4-barrel and the Q-jet and bone stock, and this was a stock flat tap, a hydraulic flat tap, a camshaft as well. This combination produced 278 horsepower. Yes, a whopping 278 horsepower, but 385 foot-pounds of torque. So it was fairly torquey. And just as a quick example, here's what happened when the red is the 2-barrel intake manifold and carburetor. So all we did was upgrade basically from a 2-barrel to a 4-barrel, and the power went up from 248 horsepower to 278 horsepower. So a good quick 30 horsepower gain. And really, even down low, even below 2,500 RPM, the 4-barrel stuff was still as good or better than the 2-barrel stuff. So it just goes to show you, if you have a 2-barrel small block Chevy, you should put a 4-barrel on it. But that's not really our test. Here's what happened when we replaced the 4-barrel cast iron quadrajet manifold with a WEIAND 8004 aluminum intake manifold. And that's in red. You can see that the WEIAND did indeed make more power out of the top, like we saw with the other Ford application. It produced 287 horsepower, but you can see in the middle it lost quite a bit of torque. In fact, the peak torque for the WEIAND was 372 foot-pounds, and it was down through the middle, what I would call the middle part of the curve, from about 2,800 to 3,800 RPM. So the Q-jet and the factory Q-jet intake manifold actually performed very well, and especially if you're looking at this for like a truck application below 4,000 RPM or even 4,200, there would really be no comparison. If you're revving it out higher than that, all the way out to 8,000 or 5,000 RPM, then you start seeing a little bit of gains from the aluminum intake manifold. Now, obviously, the aluminum intake manifold also weighs less, so you have something there. But it goes to show you, like we saw with the big block Ford, the factory intake manifold, the factory Q-jet cast iron intake manifolds, in this case on the small block, actually performs pretty well down in the lower RPM ranges. It really enhances torque production. So let's get to our final test, where we're comparing a dual plane intake manifold to a long runner EFI intake. The final illustration of how effective dual plane intake manifolds can be is actually a comparison between a dual plane intake manifold and a very long runner intake manifold on an LS application. So we're comparing a dual plane carbureted intake manifold to an EFI intake manifold, and in particular the early truck manifold, which is designed for low speed torque in truck applications. So it's a good comparison. It shows that the dual plane manifold actually is really good even down low. In fact, in this particular test, I ran it on a 6-liter, a modified 6-liter. We'll get into the description of the 6-liter. But the dual plane manifold made the most low speed power of any of the intake manifolds that I tested, including all of these long runner ones. So it does very well, especially down low. But our 6-liter was a modified version, and it had forged internals. It had a stock LQ4 block. It had a stock crankshaft, but it had Carrillo rods and CP flat top pistons on it, forged pistons. It had a good sized camshaft in it. It was a Comp 469 that I run in a lot of stuff. It was a 617, 624 lift, 231, 247 degree duration split, and 113 degree lobe separation angle. In this particular combination, it was built to do lots of other stuff other than just this intake manifold test. But we put short travel lifters in it. It had 7.3 inch push rods. And part of the push rod necessity was because, at least the length, was because we ran a set of airflow research LSX V2 230 heads. So good heads, small chambers, lots of flow, plenty of potential. Because what I wanted to do in this test is I wanted to demonstrate what the limitations of the intake manifold were if everything else was right. So we had a good motor in a 6-liter, we had a good camshaft, and good cylinder heads. We ran this with 1 7/8 headers and a Holley HP management system the way that we normally do. We did run extensions on the headers and mufflers, so the low speed power thing was kind of taken care of. We only ran, when I'm saying low speed, we only ran this thing down to around 3,000 RPM on this intake manifold test. So this worked out very well. But our first comparison was, we ran this with the a lot of different intake manifolds, but this is a comparison with the early truck manifold. And run with the early truck manifold and the Holley HP, this thing made 549 horsepower and 481 foot-pounds of torque. Now this thing would eventually make close to 600 with a good manifold on it, like a fast LSX-RT or LSXR, and so it was closer to 600 horsepower, but we never improved on the low-speed power with any of the other EFI manifolds. But here's, and you can see it made 481 foot-pounds, and down here you can see the torque curve down below 3,500 RPM or below 4,000 RPM, which was kind of where we're concentrating our attention on. So here's what happened when we installed a RPM dual-plane intake manifold from EDELBROCK. We'll see. And we even ran a 950 Ultra XP carburetor on it. We could have run a smaller one. I don't think that the smaller carburetor would have helped low speed power. Maybe it would have helped a little bit. It would certainly help response, but the dual plane already is fairly responsive in terms of signal to the carburetor already. But you can see that the dual plane, it made a little bit less peak power. 544 horsepower. Peak torque was down, although it occurred lower. 470 foot-pounds. But from 43 or 4,400 RPM on down, the dual plane actually made a little bit more torque. And I think we'd see even greater gains on the dual plane on a different combination with a slightly milder camshaft. But again, it goes to show you that the dual plane intake manifold, even compared to a really long runner EFI manifold, does really good at lower power speeds. Now, if we were to run this thing down at 2,000, there would be another consideration, not so much the intake design comparison, but actually what's going on with the signal to the carburetor, because that's going to also determine, the signal to the carburetor is also going to determine what happens with ultimate power production. So it's another thing to consider. Let's get to our conclusion. Okay, guys, what do we learn about dual plane intake manifolds from this video? Well, first of all, we learned that the factory cast iron dual plane intake manifolds actually work pretty well, especially down low. So if you've got a stock combination with a stock cam and stock heads, they actually perform pretty well. In fact, better than some of the aftermarket intake manifolds. Now, if you're going to put ported heads and a bigger camshaft and maybe a bigger 4-barrel and that kind of stuff, and you're looking for more power on the big end, then the aftermarket dual plane stuff, especially something like an RPM air gap, that's going to do really well. But for stock stuff, the stock manifold, stop throwing those away. They work pretty well. Now, what about our comparison between the dual plane intake manifold and then the long runner factory truck EFI intake manifold? What about that comparison? Is it possible that the dual plane could actually compete with that long runner EFI intake manifold? And actually the case, yes, it definitely does. As we saw, the dual plane intake manifold actually works pretty well as a design for low speed power production, even when compared to the long runner EFI intake manifolds. Armature Roller, make sure to like, share, subscribe, ring the bell, do all that stuff. I'll keep testing.